The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the museum's archive room, dust particles dancing in the beams of light. The smell of old paper and preservation chemicals hung in the air as the chief curator carefully pulled another box from the stack. She had been working in this room for over 20 years, but still felt a thrill every time she opened a new collection. History held so many secrets, and sometimes, if you were lucky, those secrets found their way into your hands. The curator brushed a strand of graying hair from her face and checked the label on the box. Thompson Collection, 1871, it read in faded handwriting. This particular donation had come from the great-grandson of a railway engineer who had worked on the first transcontinental railroad. The family had kept these photographs for generations before deciding they belonged somewhere they could be properly preserved and studied. "Let's see what we have here," she murmured to herself, gently lifting the lid. Inside were several manila envelopes, each containing photographs protected by acid-free paper. She handled them with gloved hands, respecting their age and fragility. The first few were typical of the era: solemn family portraits, images of steam locomotives, and formal photographs of railway workers standing proudly beside their engineering achievements. Then she came to the last envelope. Inside was a remarkably well-preserved group photograph of 7 men in formal Victorian attire. They stood before what appeared to be a newly constructed railway station, their expressions serious as was customary in photographs of that time. The long exposure times required subjects to remain perfectly still, which explained why smiles were rare in early photography. The curator might have simply logged this photograph and moved on, but something caught her eye. She reached for her magnifying glass, leaning in closer. The fourth man from the left stood slightly different from the others. While his companions maintained the rigid posture typical of 19th century photography, there was something oddly relaxed about him, almost modern in his stance. And was that the hint of a smile? In 1871, that would have been unusual, but it was what he held in his hand that made her breath catch. "This can't be right," she whispered, adjusting her glasses and looking even closer. The object was partially concealed by the man's fingers, but its shape was unmistakable to anyone living in the 21st century. It looked for all the world like a smartphone. The curator sat back in her chair, her heart beating faster. She'd been in this field long enough to know that historical artifacts sometimes played tricks on the eye. Objects from the past could appear to be something they weren't. There were logical explanations. Perhaps it was an unusual pocket watch or some other period device that merely resembled a modern gadget. She picked up her phone and called her colleague, the museum's expert in photographic authentication. "I need you to come look at something," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "and bring your best equipment." An hour later, the authentication expert arrived with his tools: specialized cameras, a portable digital microscope, and a laptop loaded with image analysis software. He was a younger man with meticulous attention to detail and a reputation for being able to spot even the most sophisticated forgeries. "So what's got you so worked up?" he asked, setting up his equipment. The curator pointed to the photograph. "Fourth man from the left. Look at what he's holding." The expert leaned in, his eyebrows rising slowly as he focused on the detail. Without a word, he began capturing high-resolution images and transferring them to his laptop. "Let's enhance this," he said, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. The image on his screen zoomed in on the man's hand, then sharpened. They both stared at what came into focus. The object was rectangular with rounded corners. The man's thumb appeared to be positioned over what looked like a button or small screen. At the edge that was visible, there seemed to be several small circles that resembled the camera lenses on modern phones. "This has to be a fake," the expert said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Let me check for signs of digital manipulation." The next few hours passed in focused silence as they subjected the photograph to every authentication test they had. The paper dated correctly to the 1871 period. The photographic chemicals were consistent with those used at the time. There were no signs of digital alteration or modern tampering. "The photograph itself is genuine," the expert finally concluded, rubbing his tired eyes. "Either that object isn't what it appears to be, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. Neither of them wanted to state the impossible alternative. By the afternoon, they had called in the museum's historian who specialized in 19th century technology. She examined the photograph with growing amazement. This doesn't match any device I've ever seen from this period, she said. The closest thing would be a pocket watch, but the shape is all wrong. And look at how he's holding it, like he's looking at a screen. Word of the strange discovery began to spread through the museum staff. By the end of the day, a small group had gathered in the archive room, all offering theories. Maybe it's just an unusual case for a pocket watch. Could it be some inventor's prototype that never caught on? What if it's a practical joke someone played back then? The curator listened to all the theories but kept returning to the photograph, studying the mysterious man's face. Unlike his companions who stared at the camera with the solemn expressions typical of early photography, this man seemed to have a knowing look in his eyes, as if he understood something the others didn't. That evening, after everyone else had gone home, the curator stayed late, digging through the rest of the Thompson collection. There had to be more information, a note, a diary entry, something to explain the anomaly. In a small notebook that had been included with the photographs, she found a list of names. Her finger ran down the page until she found a notation beside the fourth position. W.H., engineer and tinkerer, disappeared 1872. The following morning, she arrived early and headed straight to the museum's research library. The reference librarian helped her search through old newspapers and records from the 1870s. By midday, they had found several mentions of a railway engineer who had gained a reputation for unusual ideas and inventions. One article described him as a man whose mind seems to exist half in our world and half in the future. Most intriguingly, they found a small news item from late 1872, reporting that the engineer had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a workshop full of strange devices and incomprehensible drawings. The authorities at the time had concluded he had either gone mad and wandered off, or had fled creditors after his unsuccessful inventions left him in debt. The curator couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. That night she dreamed of the man with the device, imagining him looking directly at her across the centuries, trying to tell her something important. The next day, she called a meeting with the museum director and the heads of various departments. She spread out the evidence they had gathered, the photograph, the enhanced images, the authentication reports, and the historical records about the mysterious engineer who disappeared. "We need to expand this investigation," she said. "This could be nothing, a misidentified object, a coincidence of shape and shadow. But if it's not—" She paused, aware of how her next words would sound. "If it's not, this could change our understanding of history." The room was quiet as everyone contemplated the implications. Finally, the director spoke. "Let's bring in outside experts. I want the best people analyzing this. Historians, photographic specialists, even technology experts who can tell us exactly how similar this object is to modern devices." As the meeting broke up, the curator returned to the archive room, drawn back to the photograph that had started it all. She looked into the eyes of the man with the mysterious device and felt a connection across time. Who was he really? What was he holding? And why did he look like he knew something no one else in his time could possibly know? Little did she realize that this was just the beginning of a mystery that would soon capture the attention of the entire world. Within a week, the museum's quiet research rooms had transformed into a hive of activity. Experts from various fields arrived daily, each bringing specialized knowledge and equipment. The photograph of the 7 railway men from 1871 now sat in a secure, climate-controlled case, but enlarged copies covered the walls. With the mysterious fourth man's image and his strange device, magnified several times, the curator watched as a photography historian carefully examined the original photograph under specialized lighting. The silver halide process is consistent with early 1870s techniques, she explained. See how the edges have this particular type of fading? That's impossible to fake convincingly. And the paper composition matches samples we have from the same period. Next to her, a forensic image analyst ran the high-resolution scans through specialized software on his laptop. His fingers moved quickly over the keyboard as different filters and analyses flashed across his screen. "No signs of manipulation," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "If this is a hoax, it would have had to be created in the 1870s, which makes no sense. Nobody back then could have imagined a smartphone." The curator nodded thoughtfully. "What about the chemical analysis?" A woman in a lab coat looked up from her microscope. "The chemical signature of the photographic process is authentic. I've compared it to other verified photos from the same year. It's a match." They had even carefully removed a tiny sample from the edge of the photograph for carbon dating, which had confirmed its age. Every test pointed to the same conclusion. The photograph was genuinely from 1871, but that only deepened the mystery of what the fourth man was. Holding, "Let's focus on what we know about him," suggested the museum director, pointing to a sparse timeline they had constructed on a whiteboard. His name was William Harrison, according to the notebook that came with the photo collection. He was a railway engineer, but also described as an inventor or tinkerer. And he disappeared in 1872, less than a year after this photograph was taken. People didn't just vanish back then, said a historian specializing in the American 19th century, not without leaving some kind of trace, especially someone connected to the railways, which were major corporations with extensive records. That afternoon, they divided into teams. Some focused on tracking down more information about Harrison through historical records, while others continued analyzing the device in his hand. The technology experts created detailed sketches based on what was visible in the photograph, trying to reverse engineer what the object might have been. "The proportions are remarkably similar to a modern smartphone," said one tech analyst, holding up his own phone next to the enlarged image, "and the way his thumb is positioned suggests he's interacting with it, not just holding it." "Could it be some kind of prototype calculator?" suggested another researcher. "There were mechanical calculating devices in that era. Not that small and not with that shape," responded the historian. The first portable calculators weren't developed until a century later. As days turned into weeks, the investigation gained momentum and attracted attention. The museum's directors had initially kept the discovery quiet, fearing ridicule if they made extraordinary claims that later turned out to have a simple explanation. But as the evidence mounted that something truly unusual had been captured in the photograph, they decided to cautiously reach out to select colleagues at other institutions. A professor from a prestigious university's physics department arrived, bringing fresh perspective. After examining all the evidence, she sat back with a thoughtful expression. "There are really only three possibilities here," she said. "One, the object is something from that time period that coincidentally resembles a modern device. Two, the photograph is an elaborate hoax that somehow used materials and techniques from the 1870s. Or three," she paused, and the room grew quiet. "Or three, we're looking at something that challenges our understanding of history and possibly physics itself." That evening, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A librarian from a small historical society in western Pennsylvania responded to one of their inquiries about William Harrison. "We have a collection of his personal effects," the email read. "They were donated in the 1920s by a distant relative. Nobody has shown much interest in them until now." 2 days later, the curator and the museum director found themselves in a tiny, underfunded archive, where the librarian led them to a dusty box containing Harrison's possessions. Inside were journals, sketches, and various small mechanical parts. The curator carefully opened the first journal, dated 1869-1870. The handwriting was neat, but the content was strange. Harrison wrote about dreams where he saw people using small glowing devices to talk to each other across vast distances. He described these dreams as so vivid that he began trying to build what he had seen. He thought they were visions, the curator said, turning the pages carefully. "But these sketches, they look like crude attempts to draw modern technology." One page showed a rough sketch of a rectangular device with a glass front, labeled the seeing box. Notes in the margins described it as allowing a person to witness events happening elsewhere and storing images within itself. "This is remarkable," whispered the director. Either Harrison was a visionary genius who somehow predicted technology that wouldn't exist for another century, or he somehow saw the future, the curator finished. The journals became increasingly strange over time. Harrison wrote about visitors who came to him in the night, showing him objects from another time. He described struggling to understand the principles behind the devices they showed him and his attempts to recreate them with the materials available to him in the 1870s. The last journal entry, dated just 3 days before his reported disappearance, was particularly disturbing. "They say I must go with them now. They say I have seen too much, learned too much for this time. I do not know if I shall return. I leave these notes behind in hopes that someday they will make sense to someone. The future is more wonderful and terrible than anyone could imagine. The curator and director exchanged looks. Neither wanted to be the first to suggest what they were both thinking. Back at the museum, they shared their findings with the research team. The journals were subjected to the same rigorous authentication process as the photograph. With the same results, they were genuine articles from the 1870s. "We need to look at his actual inventions," said one of the technology experts. "These journals mention prototypes he built. If we could find one," the search expanded. They contacted railway companies, historical societies, and antique collectors. They placed carefully worded advertisements in historical research publications, seeking any devices attributed to William Harrison. Their efforts paid off when a railway museum in Chicago responded. They had a small mechanical device in their collection, labeled only as Harrison's patent communicator, circa 1870. It had been sitting in storage for decades, considered nothing more than a failed curiosity. When the device arrived, carefully packed and transported under secure conditions, the entire research team gathered around as it was unwrapped. It was roughly the size and shape of a cigar box, with brass fittings and what appeared to be a small glass panel on one side. Inside was an intricate arrangement of gears, wires, and an unusual crystalline component that none of the experts could identify. "It's like he was trying to build a primitive cell phone," said one of the tech analysts, carefully examining the mechanism, but with 19th century materials and knowledge of physics. As fascinating as the device was, it didn't provide definitive answers. If anything, it deepened the mystery. How had Harrison conceived of such a device decades before the technology that would make it possible? And what had happened to him after he disappeared in 1872? The team now faced a difficult decision. The evidence they had gathered was compelling but controversial. Publishing their findings would invite scrutiny, possibly ridicule from the academic community. But keeping the discovery quiet seemed impossible as more people became involved in the investigation. "We need to go public," the curator finally said, but carefully. "We present the evidence without making claims about how or why this happened. We let the scientific community examine what we've found and draw their own conclusions." The director nodded slowly. "Agreed. We'll prepare a paper for the Journal of Historical Analysis. We stick to the facts, the authentication of the photograph, Harrison's journals and device, his disappearance. No speculation about time travel or visitors from the future." As they dispersed to continue their work, the curator found herself alone with the photograph once more. She stared at William Harrison's face, at his slight smile and knowing eyes. What had he seen? Where had he gone? And why had he left behind such tantalizing clues for the future to find? The mystery of the man with the impossible device was about to go public, and the world would never be the same. The museum's press conference room had never been so packed. Journalists from major news outlets crowded together. Cameras and microphones pointed at the small stage where the curator and the museum director sat nervously. Behind them, a large screen displayed the enhanced image of William Harrison holding the mysterious device. "We've asked you here today to share a historical discovery that raises some unusual questions," the director began. Her voice was steady, but her hands gripped the podium tightly. 3 months ago, our team discovered a photograph from 1871 that contains an object that bears a striking resemblance to modern technology. The presentation was careful and methodical. They explained the authentication process, showed the results of their tests, and presented Harrison's journals and prototype device without speculation. As they spoke, the room grew increasingly quiet, the journalists too stunned to even take notes. When the floor opened for questions, there was a moment of silence before the room erupted. "Are you suggesting this is evidence of time travel? Could this be some sort of elaborate hoax? Have you ruled out the possibility that Harrison simply invented something ahead of his time?" The curator took a deep breath. "We're not making any claims about how this came to be. We're simply presenting the evidence we've found and inviting the scientific community to help us understand it." By that evening, the story had exploded across the internet. News websites ran headlines ranging from "Time Traveler Caught in 1871 Photograph" to "The Victorian Smartphone, History's Greatest Inventor You've Never Heard of." Social media buzzed with theories, memes, and heated debates. The museum's website crashed from the traffic as people tried to view the high-resolution images they had posted. Within days, a line of visitors stretched around the block, all hoping to see the original photograph now on display in a special exhibition. Among those drawn to the story was a retired history professor from a small college in New Hampshire. He arrived at the museum one rainy Tuesday morning, requesting to speak with the curator. He was in his 70s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and he carried an old leather briefcase that had seen better days. "My grandfather used to tell me stories," he explained once they were seated in the curator's office. "Stories about his great-uncle William who disappeared under mysterious circumstances. I always thought they were just family tales, the kind that get exaggerated over time. But when I saw your photograph on the news..." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a small wooden box. "These belonged to William Harrison. They've been passed down through the family, but no one paid much attention to them. We all thought they were just the ramblings of an eccentric inventor." Inside the box was a collection of loose papers, sketches, and a small leather-bound book that looked like a personal diary. The curator's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The diary entries were more personal than the formal journals they had found previously. Harrison wrote about his daily life, his struggles with being understood, and his growing isolation as his ideas became increasingly strange to those around him. One entry from January 1870 stood out. "The first visitor came to me tonight. I was working late in my workshop when a light appeared, brighter than any lamp. A man stepped out of it, dressed in clothes unlike any I've seen. He spoke strangely, but I understood him somehow. He showed me a small device that he said could capture images in an instant and send messages across the world. When I asked how such things were possible, he said, 'Where I come from, these are as common as pocket watches are to you.' I thought I was dreaming, but when I awoke this morning, I found a small metal component on my workbench that I know was not there before." The professor watched as the curator read. "There's more," he said quietly. "My grandfather said William had been working on a book before he disappeared. The family legend was that he had hidden it somewhere, afraid that people would think him mad if they read it. The team spent the next weeks following the clues in Harrison's diary. They traveled to the small Pennsylvania town where he had lived and worked, hoping to find his workshop or any other remains of his life there. The local historical society helped them locate the site where his house once stood, now replaced by a more modern building. It was the property owner's daughter, a girl of about 10, who made the discovery. While the adults were examining old property maps in the backyard, she had wandered off to a large oak tree at the edge of the property. "I found something," she called out, pointing excitedly at a small metal box partially exposed by recent rains, buried among the tree's roots. The box was corroded, but intact. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from moisture, was a manuscript titled "Messages from Tomorrow." Harrison's name was written on the first page, along with the date, March 15, 1872, just 1 week before his reported disappearance. The manuscript was more coherent than his journals, as if he had finally organized his thoughts and experiences into a single narrative. He described regular visits from what he called travelers, who showed him devices and concepts from their time. Harrison had attempted to understand these technologies through the scientific knowledge of his own era, often struggling to find the right words to describe what he had seen. Most remarkable were his detailed sketches of devices that wouldn't be invented for a century or more, primitive drawings of computers, televisions, and various wireless communication tools. In some cases, he had attempted to create basic versions of these technologies using 19th century materials, explaining his strange prototype, communicator. The final pages of the manuscript contained Harrison's growing concern that he had been shown too much, learned too much for his own time. He wrote about the traveler's warnings that his knowledge could alter the course of technological development if shared too soon. The very last entry sent chills through everyone who read it. "They have told me I must leave. The world of 1872 is no longer where I belong. They say I have become a bridge between times and that such bridges are dangerous. Tomorrow night, they will take me to see wonders beyond imagination. I do not know if I shall ever return, or if anyone in this time will remember me when I am gone. I leave behind these notes and my devices, buried where perhaps someone in the right time will find them. To whoever reads this, the future is more magnificent than you can dream and closer than you think." The discovery of the manuscript transformed the investigation. It provided a coherent narrative that connected all the pieces they had found so far: the photograph, the journals, the strange device. But rather than solving the mystery, it deepened it. Had Harrison truly been visited by time travelers? Had he somehow been taken into the future? The story captured the world's imagination. Scientists debated the theoretical possibilities of time travel. Historians re-examined other inventors and visionaries throughout history, looking for similar cases. Technology companies studied Harrison's sketches, fascinated by how a man from the 1870s had conceptualized devices that would eventually become reality. The museum exhibition expanded, now featuring the manuscript alongside the photograph and Harrison's prototype devices. Visitors came from around the world, standing in line for hours just to catch a glimpse of what many were calling the most important historical discovery of the century. For the curator, the most compelling evidence remained the photograph itself. In quiet moments, she would study Harrison's face, that knowing half-smile, the confident way he held the device while his contemporaries stood stiffly beside him. In his eyes, she saw a man who had glimpsed something beyond his time, who carried knowledge no one else in his era possessed. As public interest in the story grew and more experts became involved in the investigation, no one realized that the most extraordinary revelations were yet to come. The mystery of William Harrison was about to take an even more unexpected turn, one that would challenge the very foundations of how we understand time itself. 6 months after the initial discovery of the photograph, the world remained captivated by the mystery of William Harrison. The museum had transformed its main exhibition hall into what they called the Harrison Experience, featuring not only the original photograph and manuscript but interactive displays, explaining the authentication process and the historical context of the 1870s. People waited in lines that stretched for blocks, sometimes camping overnight to secure tickets. The gift shop couldn't keep up with demand for replicas of the photograph and copies of Harrison's manuscript, which had been carefully transcribed and published as a best-selling book. The museum's website had a live counter, showing visitors from around the globe, over 2 million and climbing daily. But beyond public fascination, the discovery had sparked serious academic debate across multiple fields. In a packed lecture hall at a prestigious university, a panel discussion featuring historians, physicists, and technology experts was underway. The audience, a mix of students, professors, and curious members of the public, listened intently as the experts debated the implications of the Harrison evidence. What we're seeing here is either the most elaborate hoax in history or something that challenges our fundamental understanding of time, said a physicist, her hands moving animatedly as she spoke. The theoretical framework for time travel requires energy levels we can't currently achieve, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. I think we're overlooking the simplest explanation, countered a technology historian. Harrison was a visionary genius like Leonardo da Vinci, who could conceptualize technologies far beyond his time. The human imagination is powerful. Perhaps he simply dreamed up these devices through sheer creative insight. Then how do you explain the photograph? Asked another panelist. The authentication is conclusive. That's a real photograph from 1871, showing a man holding what appears to be a modern device. Imagination doesn't explain that. These conversations were happening everywhere, in university classrooms, online forums, coffee shops, and dinner tables around the world. Everyone had a theory, from the scholarly to the wildly speculative. Television specials featured interviews with the museum team, technology CEOs weighing in on Harrison's predictions, and even psychics claiming to channel Harrison's spirit. Late-night comedy shows created skits about time travelers accidentally leaving their phones in the past, while serious documentaries explored the scientific possibilities of time travel. Several major technology companies had formed research teams dedicated to studying Harrison's designs. One Silicon Valley billionaire offered $1 million reward for additional evidence related to Harrison or other potential time anomalies in historical records. The curator who had first discovered the photograph now found herself reluctantly famous. She had appeared on magazine covers, been interviewed countless times, and received both acclaim and criticism from fellow academics. Some praised her meticulous research methods, while others suggested she had been too quick to embrace extraordinary explanations. One morning, as she arrived at the museum, she was surprised to find a small package waiting on her desk. It had been delivered by courier with no return address. Inside was a small brass key and a note that simply read, Safety Deposit Box No. 247, First National Bank, Downtown Branch. Harrison had more than one friend from the future. The handwriting was unfamiliar. She turned the key over in her hand, wondering if this was someone's idea of a joke or a hoax. With all the publicity surrounding the case, the museum had received hundreds of false leads and claims. But something about the simplicity of this message felt different. She called the museum director, and after some discussion, they decided to investigate. The bank confirmed that Box 247 did indeed exist, and had been paid for in perpetuity by an anonymous client in 1890. According to their records, it had never been accessed. When they opened the safety deposit box, they found a sealed envelope yellowed with age, addressed to the finder of Harrison's photograph, along with a small metal object about the size of a coin. The object was unlike anything they had seen before. A perfect circle of what appeared to be metal but was lighter than aluminum, with intricate patterns etched into its surface and a small crystal embedded in its center. The letter inside the envelope was dated November 1890, nearly 20 years after Harrison's disappearance. To whom it may concern if you are reading this, then William's photograph has finally been discovered and recognized for what it truly is. My name is not important, but I was another who was contacted by the visitors. There were several of us scattered throughout this time, chosen for reasons I still do not fully understand. William was the first, and perhaps they shared too much with him. I met him only once shortly before he left. He knew by then that he would be going with them, but he was troubled by what he was leaving behind. He gave me this device, what they called a temporal anchor, and asked me to keep it safe until the right time came. The visitors explained that time is not a straight line, but a complex web of possibilities. They come from one possible future, not the only future. Their technology allows them to observe other timelines, other possibilities, and occasionally to interact with them. They are researchers, studying the pivotal moments in history where multiple futures diverge. William was special to them because he could see beyond the constraints of his time. His mind was open to possibilities that others couldn't comprehend. But his knowledge created a danger. If he had shared everything he knew too soon, our development would have followed a different path, perhaps a dangerous one. I am an old man now, and I have kept this secret my entire life. I place this letter and the anchor in this box to be found when the time is right. The anchor contains information that only those with the proper technology can access. It is both a message and a warning. Look to the skies in the coming years. They are watching, and they are closer than you think, a fellow traveler. The letter created a sensation even greater than the original discovery. Scientists carefully examined the temporal anchor, finding that it contained materials and manufacturing techniques unknown to modern science. The crystal at its center emitted unusual energy patterns that defied conventional analysis. As news of this second discovery spread, people began searching historical records for other potential travelers or recipients of future knowledge. Amateur historians combed through patents, journals, and photographs from the 19th and early 20th centuries, looking for other technological anomalies or individuals who might have had contact with the mysterious visitors. The story took an even more dramatic turn when an astronomy professor from a university in Chile made a startling announcement. His team had been tracking an unusual object in Earth's orbit, first detected 2 years earlier but dismissed as space debris. After recalculating its trajectory in light of the recent revelations, he discovered something peculiar. The object had appeared suddenly with no launch trajectory from Earth, and its movements occasionally defied the laws of physics as we understand them. We can't say for certain what this object is, the professor explained during a press conference that was broadcast globally. But its behavior is consistent with technology far beyond our current capabilities, and it seems to be watching us. News channels ran continuous coverage of the night sky, with people around the world pointing telescopes and cameras upward, hoping to catch a glimpse of something extraordinary. Religious leaders offered their interpretations of the events, some seeing them as fulfillment of prophecies, others cautioning against jumping to conclusions. Governments that had initially dismissed the Harrison story as a historical curiosity now held emergency meetings to discuss its implications. Intelligence agencies began quietly investigating the temporal anchor and other evidence, while military branches reviewed their protocols for potential contact with advanced technology or beings. Through it all, the original photograph continued to draw visitors to the museum. People stood before it for hours, staring into William Harrison's knowing eyes, searching for answers to questions that grew bigger by the day. Who were these visitors? Why had they chosen Harrison and others? And most importantly, what did they want? As theories multiplied and the world waited for answers, few people noticed a quiet elderly woman who visited the exhibition every Tuesday afternoon. She would stand at the back of the crowd, watching people's reactions more than the exhibits themselves, and if anyone had paid close attention, they might have noticed the small device she occasionally held in her palm, sleek with rounded edges, not quite like any modern smartphone, before slipping it back into her pocket with a smile that mirrored Harrison's own. 5 years had passed since the discovery of the photograph that changed everything. What had begun as a curious historical anomaly had evolved into something that reshaped humanity's understanding of time, technology, and our place in the universe. The world had changed, but the mystery endured. The museum that had once struggled for funding now occupied an expanded campus, with the original photograph housed in a special wing visited by millions each year. The curator who had first noticed Harrison's strange device had become the director of what was now called the Temporal Studies Institute, overseeing research that spanned dozens of academic fields. On a crisp autumn morning, she stood at the window of her office watching visitors line up outside. Even after 5 years, people still came every day, hoping to understand the mystery that had captivated the world. She turned back to her desk where 3 people waited patiently: a physicist, a historian, and a government official. 5 years, she said, sitting down. 5 years of research, speculation, and searching. What do we actually know? The physicist, who had been involved since the early days of the investigation, spread out several papers covered with complex equations. We've confirmed that the temporal anchor contains elements that don't exist naturally on Earth. The crystal at its center generates energy patterns that match theoretical models for what we call temporal fields, distortions in the space-time continuum that could, theoretically, allow for movement between different points in time. And the object in orbit? Asked the government official. Still there, the physicist replied. Still watching. Occasionally it changes position in ways that defy our understanding of physics. Several countries have attempted to send probes closer to it, but it simply moves away, maintaining the same distance. It doesn't appear hostile, just observant. The historian cleared his throat. We've identified 14 other potential contacts throughout history. Individuals who made inexplicable leaps in knowledge or who created designs far beyond the technology of their time. In each case, there were journals or letters mentioning dreams, visions, or visitors who showed them things from another time. But nothing as definitive as Harrison's photograph, the director noted. No, agreed the historian. That remains unique. Though we did find something interesting in the Cambridge University archives. Astronomical records from March 1870, around the time Harrison first mentioned his visitors in his journal. There was an unusual aurora borealis display visible much further south than normal. Some modern physicists have suggested it could have been associated with a magnetic anomaly. Or a temporal displacement event, the physicist added. A momentary thinning of the barriers between different points in time. The government official, who represented an international task force created to monitor and respond to potential temporal phenomena, leaned forward. The public is growing restless for answers. It's been 5 years. We've had everything from doomsday cults to time traveler welcome committees setting up camps in major cities. The director nodded thoughtfully. People want certainty. They want to know who these visitors were, why they contacted Harrison, whether they're still watching us. But the truth is, we may never have all the answers. As their meeting continued, across town an elderly woman made her weekly visit to the exhibition. The museum staff knew her by now. She came every Tuesday. Always alone, always staying until closing time. Some of the younger guides had created stories about her, that she was a distant relative of Harrison, or perhaps a time traveler herself. They called her the Tuesday Lady and watched with curiosity as she moved through the displays with a quiet intensity. Today, she paused longer than usual at a new addition to the exhibition, a wall showing Messages Through Time, where visitors could write notes to either the past or the future, Children often left drawings of flying cars and robots, while adults wrote more philosophical reflections about what they wished people from other times could know. The elderly woman read each message carefully, occasionally touching the wall with a weathered hand. Then she took a small notebook from her purse and wrote something before tucking it away again. That evening, as the museum prepared to close, one of the young guides approached her. "We're closing soon," she said gently, "but I've noticed you here every week. You must find this all very interesting." The elderly woman smiled. "Time is a strange thing, don't you think? Most people see it as a straight line, past, present, future. But it's more like a river with currents and eddies, places where the water flows backward for a moment before continuing on." The guide looked at her curiously. "Do you believe they were time travelers? The ones who contacted Harrison?" "Perhaps," the woman said. "Or perhaps they were something else entirely. People always try to understand the unknown by comparing it to what they already know." "What do you think they wanted?" The elderly woman looked around at the exhibition, at the images of Harrison and his strange device, at the replica of the temporal anchor, at the photographs of the mysterious object in orbit. "To observe, to understand, perhaps to guide in small ways." She smiled again. "Imagine watching a child learn to walk. You don't carry them everywhere or they would never learn. But sometimes when they might fall too hard, you offer a steadying hand." Before the guide could respond, the woman reached into her purse and handed her the notebook she had written in earlier. "Perhaps you could add this to the wall for me. My old fingers don't work as well as they used to." Then she walked away, disappearing into the crowd of departing visitors. The guide looked down at the notebook where a single line was written in elegant handwriting. "The future is not fixed. You are creating it with every choice you make." When she looked up to thank the woman, she was gone. Later that night, as the museum stood empty and quiet, something unprecedented happened. The object in Earth's orbit, which had maintained its distance for 5 years, suddenly moved. Automated tracking systems around the world recorded its descent into the atmosphere, but instead of burning up or crashing, it simply vanished from all monitoring systems. By morning, reports began coming in from around the globe. In hundreds of locations, people discovered small metallic disks, each with a crystal center similar to the temporal anchor. And when scientists managed to analyze the energy patterns emitted by these disks, they found they contained data, vast amounts of information encoded in a way that existing computers could barely begin to process. It would take years to fully decipher the message, but the preliminary findings sent shockwaves through the scientific community. The disks contained knowledge about clean energy, medical treatments for previously incurable diseases, and mathematical proofs that unified quantum mechanics with general relativity, the holy grail of theoretical physics that had eluded scientists for centuries. But they contained no explicit information about who had sent them or why, no introduction or explanation beyond the data itself. It was as if someone had decided humanity was ready for certain knowledge, but still needed to determine for ourselves what to do with it. The discovery of the photograph had raised profound questions, but the arrival of these disks transformed speculation into tangible benefits. As scientists around the world began applying the new knowledge, breakthroughs occurred at an unprecedented rate. Clean energy solutions began replacing fossil fuels. Medical treatment saved millions of lives. The theoretical understanding of time itself expanded in ways that had previously seemed impossible. 10 years after the initial discovery, the museum hosted a special anniversary exhibition. The original photograph of William Harrison still held its place of honor, but now it was surrounded by displays showing how the knowledge gained from the mysterious visitors had transformed society. The director, now approaching retirement age herself, often stood before Harrison's photograph during quiet moments. She studied his knowing smile, the device in his hand, and wondered about the choices that had led from that moment in 1871 to the world she now lived in. In the guest book near the exit, visitors left their thoughts about the mystery that had never been fully solved. Among the entries was one that caught her attention, written in the same elegant handwriting that had been seen once before. "Time is not a prison that holds us in the present. It is a sea we are learning to navigate together. William was not the first to glimpse other shores, nor will he be the last. Look not just forward or backward, but inward, and you may find that the greatest journey through time is the one we make in understanding ourselves and our place in a universe far more wondrous than we have yet imagined. The director smiled, running her fingers over the words. Some mysteries, she had come to believe, weren't meant to be fully solved. Sometimes the questions themselves were the gift, opening minds to possibilities that had always existed just beyond our understanding, and perhaps that had been the visitor's purpose all along.